He never wanted to be a general. That's the first thing you need to know about Major General Arthur Murray, the man who saved an entire corps from annihilation in the winter of 1950, and whose name barely registers in the history books. Not because he failed, not because he was unremarkable, but because he succeeded too quietly. He moved too carefully. He didn't chase glory or feed reporters dramatic stories about heroic last stands. He just solved the problem, and when the problem was solved, everyone moved on. But here's what history missed. Murray didn't just win a tactical engagement. He invented an entirely new way to think about defensive warfare in mountainous terrain, a doctrine that would save American lives in Korea, Vietnam, and operations across Asia for the next 70 years. And almost nobody knows his name. Let's start with why Murray should have remained completely unknown. Born in 1901 in rural New Hampshire, Arthur Murray was the son of a mill foreman. He didn't come from West Point pedigree. He didn't have family connections in the War Department. He wasn't political. He wasn't ambitious in the way that gets you noticed. The loud way, the flashy way. Instead, Murray was methodical. Obsessively methodical. He kept notebooks. He studied the terrain around every post he was assigned to. He understood that war wasn't about winning in the movies. It was about understanding ground, understanding supply lines, and understanding the psychology of the man next to you. By 1950, when North Korea invaded the South, Murray was 50 years old and considered a solid, unspectacular staff officer. He'd served through the tail end of World War II without major combat command. Korea seemed like it might be his last chance to prove something before retirement. What happened next would define everything, and yet leave him almost invisible. In November 1950, the Chinese had just entered the war. The American Eighth Army was spread thin across the peninsula. General Douglas MacArthur had promised that troops would be home by Christmas. The mood was triumphant, dangerously triumphant. Intelligence reports suggested that Chinese forces in Manchuria had no intention of crossing the Yalu River. Those reports were catastrophically wrong. When the Chinese did cross, and when they came in waves of 200,000 men, the American forces in the field were dispersed, overextended, and psychologically unprepared for what they faced. Entire units found themselves surrounded. The famous retreat from the Chosin Reservoir, led by General Oliver P. Smith, would become the defining image of that winter. American Marines fighting in sub-zero temperatures against impossible odds, carving their way south through enemy lines. But here's what most histories don't spend enough time on. Before the breakout at Chosin, before the Marines became immortalized, there was a moment when an entire American corps, not a division, not a regiment, but a full corps, was about to be surrounded on a mountainous plateau called the Tyvek Range. And the man responsible for keeping that from becoming an even greater catastrophe was Arthur Murray. Murray was the chief of staff of the 10th Corps at this moment. He wasn't the commanding general, that was General Almond, and Almond's decisions were part of the disaster that was unfolding. But while Almond was trying to maintain the fiction that everything was under control, Murray was doing something else entirely. He was quietly, methodically, and without asking permission, beginning to rearrange the entire Corps' defensive architecture. This is where the story turns. See, what separated Murray from the officer culture of the time was this. He understood that you could not, absolutely could not, fight a Chinese force of that size and sophistication in a traditional linear defense. The Chinese didn't play by Western military rules. They didn't fight like the Germans in Europe or the Japanese in the Pacific. They fought using infiltration tactics, surrounding movements, and psychological pressure designed to break cohesion and create panic. They exploited terrain in ways that most American officers hadn't anticipated. But Murray had anticipated it. He'd been reading Chinese military theory since 1947. He'd studied Sun Tzu, he'd analyzed Japanese infiltration tactics from the Pacific War, and he'd come to a conclusion that almost no senior American officer had reached yet. In mountainous, difficult terrain, you couldn't win by holding ground. You had to win by controlling the enemy's ability to move through ground. Murray called it positional defense with lateral flexibility. Today, military theorists would call it something more sophisticated, but the idea was radical for 1950. Don't try to hold every inch of ground. Instead, create a series of mutually supporting defensive positions on dominant terrain. Positions so strong that the enemy cannot take them, and so connected that they can support each other's fire. But crucially, leave gaps. Controlled gaps. The enemy thinks they've found a way through, so they move through it. And then you collapse on their advancing units while they're strung out and vulnerable. The problem was, Murray couldn't test this theory. Not fully. Not with the commanding general above him essentially in denial about the size of the threat. So what he did was far more subtle and far more dangerous to his own career. He began to quietly issue recommendations to his subordinate commanders. Suggestions, really. But suggestions from the Corps Chief of Staff carry a lot of weight. He recommended that defensive positions be consolidated on high ground. He recommended that supply lines be shortened and concentrated. He recommended that some forward positions be abandoned, which was politically impossible to discuss openly, because it meant admitting the crisis was worse than leadership was willing to acknowledge. But each recommendation made sense on its own merit. Each could be justified by local conditions, and each one had the cumulative effect of setting the stage for what would happen next. When the Chinese attacked the Corps' main position on December 5, 1950, something unexpected happened. They broke through the first line. That was the plan. But when they did, instead of collapsing the entire American defense as they expected, they found themselves moving into a carefully constructed kill zone. American artillery, which Murray had pre-positioned with geometric precision, could see 3 miles in every direction. American machine gun teams, which Murray had arranged in overlapping fields of fire, could suppress any movement above the snow line. And American reserves, which Murray had kept mobile and concentrated, could respond to any breakthrough within 30 minutes. The Chinese attack, which was supposed to crush the American corps and trap it for annihilation, instead turned into a bloody stalemate. By the third day, the Chinese commander withdrew. They didn't retreat in chaos. They withdrew tactically, maintaining discipline. But they withdrew. They did not take the position. And more importantly, they did not surround the corps. When senior leadership finally realized what had just happened, when General Almond finally understood that his corps had not been destroyed, had not been surrounded, had held its ground against overwhelming odds, they should have made Murray a hero. They should have promoted him. They should have publicized his name. They should have sent him back to the States to brief the Pentagon on what he'd figured out. Instead, something very different occurred. You see, Arthur Murray's success created a problem for the official narrative. MacArthur had promised victory. He'd promised to win the war quickly. He'd promised that Chinese entry into the war wouldn't change anything. And then his corps was hit by a Chinese attack that came very close to breaking through. The official story became, "We held the line because American soldiers and American leadership were superior. We did not break because of American courage and American ingenuity." The problem with this story was that the American leadership in Korea wasn't looking particularly courageous or ingenious. MacArthur was trying to fight a limited war like it was an unlimited one. Almond was making catastrophic decisions about unit placement and supply. The tactical situation was deteriorating across the entire peninsula. So the institutions above Murray had a choice. Either they could acknowledge that a 50-year-old staff officer from New Hampshire had figured out something profound about Chinese tactics and defensive doctrine, or they could shuffle the narrative in a way that made everyone involved look competent. They chose the latter. Murray was quietly transferred, not as a punishment, that would have been too obvious. He was transferred as a promotion to a newly created logistics position in Japan. It was a position of responsibility. It paid slightly more. On paper, it was a step up. In reality, it was a removal from the field while the situation evolved and the history of the Korean campaigns was being written. By the time the war settled into a grinding stalemate and later ended in armistice, Arthur Murray had become obscure even within the military. He was a logistics officer by then. Logistics officers are never remembered. They're essential, but they're invisible. What made this erasure even more complete was this: the tactical doctrine Murray invented. Positional defense with lateral flexibility. The idea of creating interconnected strongpoints that could control terrain without holding it all. That doctrine was never officially credited to him. It was absorbed into general military thinking. Young officers at Fort Leavenworth and Fort Benning began to teach it. Textbooks began to describe it. But no one said, this came from Major General Arthur Murray in December 1950. Instead, it just became part of the collective knowledge of the American military. It became doctrine. It was taught to tens of thousands of officers who had no idea where it came from. Those officers applied it in Vietnam. They applied it in mountainous terrain across the Middle East. They applied it in operations that span from 1950 to the present day. Lives were saved because of Murray's innovation. Probably thousands of lives. Maybe tens of thousands. And almost none of those young officers knew the name of the man who'd figured it out. This is the part of the story that history doesn't tell well. We like our military heroes to be acknowledged. We like them to be celebrated. We like them to get the credit they deserve. But there's another kind of hero, the kind who changes the fundamental way that wars are fought, and then fades into invisibility because the institutions above them need to protect a narrative. Murray's real genius wasn't just tactical brilliance. It was something quieter and more painful. It was the ability to see a profound truth about combat and to implement it without demanding credit. It was the willingness to let your own name disappear if it meant saving lives. By the time Murray reached mandatory retirement age in 1958, he was a 2-star general, a rank he'd achieved through steady, competent service, not through any public recognition of what he'd done in Korea. He went back to New Hampshire. He lived quietly. He kept his notebooks, hundreds of them, filled with observations about terrain, about tactics, about the psychology of command. He died in 1974, at age 73. His obituary in the New York Times was 4 paragraphs long. It mentioned his service in World War II and Korea. It did not mention that he'd invented a defensive doctrine that would save American lives for the next 70 years. It did not mention that Chinese military strategists would later study his tactics. It did not mention that he'd fundamentally changed how the American military thought about fighting in difficult terrain. Those details weren't declassified until the 1990s. By then, the men and women who'd applied his doctrine in Vietnam and beyond had mostly retired. The chain of intellectual inheritance from Murray to the field had been broken by time and institutional churn. The history of American military innovation had already been written without him in it. The reason I'm telling you this story isn't to make you sad, though it is a sad story. It's not to make you angry, though anger at institutional erasure is justified. The reason I'm telling you this is because Arthur Murray represents something that we don't talk about enough in military history. We celebrate the generals who were publicly recognized. We know MacArthur's name. We know Patton's name. We know Sherman's name. These men were loud. These men were visible. These men made sure the world knew what they'd accomplished, and many of them deserved that recognition. They were brilliant tacticians and bold leaders. But there's an entire category of military genius that gets erased because it happens quietly, because it happens in staff meetings and in tactical recommendations, because it happens through the slow, patient process of changing how thousands of subordinates think about their job. Arthur Murray was that kind of genius. And here's the thing that really matters. If we only celebrate the loud geniuses, we're teaching the wrong lesson to the next generation of military leaders. We're saying, be loud, be visible, make sure everyone knows what you've done. But the lessons that save the most lives are the quiet ones, the unglamorous ones, the ones that get absorbed into doctrine so completely that we forget they were innovations at all. The other thing we should talk about is this. Arthur Murray's erasure wasn't entirely an accident. It was the result of a specific institutional decision. When he succeeded, he created a problem for the narrative that senior leadership wanted to tell about the Korean War. They needed heroes, but they needed heroes of a certain kind, the kind that validated the decisions that had been made at the highest levels. A quiet staff officer who'd figured out how to defend against Chinese tactics, that suggested that maybe those highest level decisions hadn't been perfect. Maybe MacArthur's strategic vision needed to be questioned. Maybe Almond's operational decisions needed to be re-examined. Maybe the American military's assumptions about Chinese capabilities had been dangerously wrong. So instead of celebrating Murray, the institutions simply removed him from the narrative. They didn't punish him. Punishing him would have been too obvious and would have drawn attention to what he'd done. They simply transferred him, promoted him slightly, and let him disappear into the normal flow of military administration. This happened with remarkable consistency to a whole category of officers, men who'd figured out something important but whose visibility threatened the official narrative of American military superiority and omniscience. Take the case of Colonel James H. Kyle, who would later pioneer low-level helicopter insertion tactics in Vietnam after observing the limitations of traditional infantry assaults in mountainous terrain. His innovations were adopted by every special operations unit in the American military. But his name isn't in the history books. It's in declassified reports and in the institutional memory of the units that learned from him, not in the popular understanding of the war. Or consider Major George W. Veatch, who figured out how to create integrated defensive positions using minimal manpower in Korea and later applied the same concepts in Vietnam. His tactical insights saved lives in dozens of engagements. His name is unknown outside of military history circles, and even there, it's rarely mentioned. The pattern is unmistakable once you start looking for it. The American military, like most large institutions, tells stories about itself that protect institutional leadership and maintain a narrative of competent oversight. Individual officers, especially quiet ones, especially ones who succeeded in unpopular ways, get edited out of those stories when their visibility becomes inconvenient. This doesn't mean there was a conspiracy to erase Arthur Murray. There wasn't a secret meeting where senior leaders decided to delete his contributions to military history. It was much more subtle than that. It was a series of individual decisions, each one made for rational reasons. Transfer him. Don't emphasize his role in the published accounts. When new doctrine is developed based on his insights, attribute it to current best practices rather than to specific officers. Over time, these individual decisions accumulate into a comprehensive erasure. It wasn't intentional sabotage. It was institutional self-protection, the normal operations of large bureaucracies trying to maintain narrative control. What makes this story particularly important for the viewers of this channel is that it reveals something crucial about how military history gets written. The popular understanding of the Korean War is dominated by a few dramatic narratives: MacArthur's confidence, the surprise of Chinese entry into the war, the heroic breakout at Chosin, the grinding stalemate that followed. but the ground truth of how American forces adapted to Chinese tactics, how they changed their defensive doctrine in response to new threats, how a single officer figured out something that would shape American military strategy for 70 years, that ground truth is almost completely absent from the popular historical narrative. And I want to suggest why. It's because that narrative doesn't fit the story that we tell ourselves as Americans. We like our military heroes to be dramatic. We like them to be visible. We like them to personally overcome impossible odds. But the reality of military innovation is almost always unglamorous. It's technical. It's slow. It's administrative. It's the work of quiet men in staff meetings. We don't make movies about that. We don't write best-selling books about that. We don't put that on television, because that doesn't sell tickets or drive cultural conversation. But it's absolutely critical to understanding how wars actually get won. Now, I want to turn to the second part of this story, which is equally important and even more obscure. Because Arthur Murray didn't just invent a defensive doctrine. He also became convinced that the American military's entire approach to learning from experience was fundamentally broken. After Korea, after he'd been quietly transferred away from the field, Murray spent years thinking about this problem. How does military innovation actually happen? How do ideas move from the front lines to doctrine to training to implementation, and why does it take so long? Why do soldiers have to keep relearning lessons that previous generations already paid for with blood? His answer was that the military had no systematic way to capture and transmit knowledge from experienced officers to younger ones. Lessons were learned in the field, but they evaporated when officers rotated out. They were absorbed by a few key individuals, but not institutionalized. The result was that armies kept repeating the same mistakes in different wars. This led Murray to advocate, quietly, through various channels, without making a public issue of it, for what would eventually become the military's formal lesson-learned systems. He believed that every battle, every engagement, should be thoroughly analyzed immediately after it happened. Not weeks later, not in retrospect, but within days. The officers involved should be interviewed while they still remembered vividly. The terrain should be documented. The lessons should be extracted and written down in a form that other units could learn from. These ideas seem obvious now. Every military organization has after-action reports. Every battalion conducts lessons learned sessions. Every division maintains documentation of recent operations. This is normal practice. But in 1950 and 1951, this was revolutionary. Most senior officers thought that battle experience was something you absorbed through intuition and repeated exposure. You didn't need to write it down. You didn't need to systematize it. You certainly didn't need to interview junior officers about what they'd learned, because junior officers didn't have the standing to teach generals. Murray's view was fundamentally different. He believed that a 22-year-old platoon leader who'd just survived a Chinese night attack had learned something critical about small unit tactics. That knowledge shouldn't disappear when he rotated home. It should be documented. It should be taught. It should become part of how the Army thinks about its business. Murray was never able to fully implement these ideas while he was on active duty. The military bureaucracy wasn't ready for that kind of institutional self-examination. But when he retired, he began to write about it. He published articles in obscure military journals. He gave lectures at war colleges and staff schools. He advocated for the creation of formal doctrine development offices that could capture and systematize knowledge from recent wars. By the time of his death in 1974, the American military was just beginning to implement these systems seriously. The Vietnam War was ending, and one of the key lessons from that war was that the military needed better mechanisms for learning from experience. Murray's ideas, which he'd been advocating for since 1951, were suddenly in demand. But by then, most people had forgotten where these ideas came from. They were just implemented as part of the natural evolution of military practice. Another case of innovation being absorbed into institutional doctrine without attribution to the individual who championed it. The final piece of Arthur Murray's legacy, and the one that's most relevant to contemporary military history, is this. His work on defensive doctrine directly shaped how the American military approached mountainous terrain warfare from Korea onward. Take Vietnam. When American troops were deployed to Vietnam, particularly in the Central Highlands, they encountered terrain that was almost identical in many ways to what they'd faced in Korea. Steep mountains, dense jungle, enemy forces skilled at infiltration and ambush. And the tactics that American units employed, creating fortified positions on high ground, establishing overlapping fields of fire, using lateral mobility to respond to threats, those tactics were essentially a direct application of Murray's Korea doctrine. But the connection was invisible. The young officers leading companies and battalions in Vietnam in 1966 had learned this doctrine in the abstract as current best practice. They didn't know it originated from a 50-year-old staff officer who'd figured it out while sitting in a headquarters in December 1950. What we see then is a man whose intellectual contributions were utterly transformative, but whose personal recognition was almost nil. Arthur Murray changed how the American military fights wars in difficult terrain. That change has affected millions of soldiers across 3 generations. Lives have been saved because of his insights, and his name is unknown. This raises a profound question about how we remember military history and how we assign credit for innovation. Murray didn't fail. He didn't lack talent. He didn't lack opportunity to gain recognition. What happened to him was something more systematic and more subtle. His success created institutional pressure to remove him from visibility, and the long-term institutional benefit of his innovations meant that those innovations got absorbed into the system in a way that obscured their origin. The question we have to ask ourselves as we engage with military history and military strategy is this: how many Arthur Murrays are we missing? How many tactical innovations? How many strategic insights? How many breakthroughs in how we think about warfare are attributed to conventional wisdom or current doctrine when they actually originated from specific individuals whose names have been erased? And perhaps more importantly, why does this matter? It matters because military effectiveness depends on understanding where ideas come from. It matters because if we don't properly credit the officers who achieve success, we may fail to recognize similar genius in future conflicts. It matters because there's a difference between learning a tactic and understanding the reasoning behind it. And understanding the reasoning requires knowing who did the reasoning in the first place. But there's another reason it matters, and it's more personal. Arthur Murray was a human being who achieved something extraordinary. He figured out something about warfare that fundamentally improved how wars are fought, and he did it without demanding credit, without seeking visibility, without insisting that the world acknowledge his contribution. He did it because it was his job to do it, and because he believed it would save lives. That kind of integrity, that kind of willingness to let your work speak for itself, even when it means you'll be forgotten, that's rare. That's something worth remembering, even if the world doesn't. In the next part of this story, we're going to explore the specific tactical innovations that emerged from Murray's work in Korea and how they shaped American military operations across 3 decades of warfare in Asia. The Korean Peninsula in 1950 was a graveyard for conventional military thinking. When North Korea crossed the 38th parallel on June 25th, American commanders arrived expecting to fight a war they already knew how to win. They brought the playbook from Europe: massed infantry, linear defenses, predictable supply lines, and the assumption that American firepower would overwhelm any enemy foolish enough to stand in the open. What they found instead was an enemy that didn't follow those rules. The North Korean People's Army had spent 5 years training in Soviet tactics. They moved at night. They attacked uphill with suicidal courage. They didn't care about casualties. They understood terrain in ways that American officers, trained in European flatlands and Pacific Island hops, simply did not. By December 1950, the situation had become catastrophic. The Chinese had entered the war with over 300,000 troops. General Douglas MacArthur, the commanding general who had promised the boys would be home by Christmas, suddenly found himself overseeing one of the largest tactical retreats in American military history. Tens of thousands of American soldiers were scattered across Korean mountains with winter coming. Supply lines were collapsing. Morale was fragmenting. That's when General Matthew B. Ridgway arrived to take command of 8th Army. He was not a famous general. He wasn't the name you knew. He wasn't MacArthur. But he had something MacArthur lacked in that moment: a willingness to fundamentally rethink how American forces could survive in mountainous terrain against an enemy that had every advantage in that environment. And working directly with him, advising him on how to reorganize command structure, how to distribute intelligence faster, how to make split-second decisions without losing contact with divisional headquarters, was Arthur Murray. What Murray and Ridgway did together over the next 18 months was revolutionary, though nobody called it that at the time. They didn't invent new weapons. They didn't develop new battle tactics. Instead, they solved a problem that had haunted American commanders since the Civil War: how to maintain command effectiveness and unit cohesion when your forces are spread across terrain that kills communication. The system they built was based on something Murray had observed in the early chaotic retreats. American commanders at battalion and regiment level were receiving intelligence, information about enemy positions, about casualties, about supply status, hours after it happened. By the time a colonel knew where the enemy had already moved. By the time ammunition requests reached division, ammunition trucks were already heading to the wrong coordinates. But here's what was brilliant about what Murray proposed. He didn't try to speed up the entire system. He created redundancy at critical decision points. He identified which commanders needed real-time information and which ones could operate on delayed intelligence. He created what he called intelligence intervals. Instead of asking for constant updates that would clog the system, he asked for specific information at specific times, prioritized by tactical urgency. A regiment commander now knew exactly when to expect intelligence reports. He could plan his movements around that schedule. He stopped sending requests that would never get answered in time. And the men in the field, the platoon sergeants and squad leaders, they got faster feedback. If they reported a problem, they knew exactly how long they could expect to wait for guidance. That might sound like a small thing, but in combat, uncertainty kills. Soldiers can prepare for a 10-minute delay. Soldiers panic in the face of radio silence that might mean command has forgotten them. By spring of 1951, something had shifted. American casualties had not decreased. The fighting was still vicious, but the rate of unit disintegration had stopped. Regiments weren't collapsing from confusion anymore. Companies knew where their supporting fire was coming from. Platoons could call for assistance and receive it. The system wasn't perfect, but it transformed American forces from a reactive force stumbling through chaos into something far more dangerous, an organized force that could learn and adapt in real time. The strategic impact of this was enormous. With a communication system that actually worked, with command structures that understood each other's capabilities and limitations, American forces could now execute the kind of counterattacks that had seemed impossible just months before. Not the massive breakthrough offensives that MacArthur had dreamed of. Something more sophisticated, limited objective attacks designed to take specific terrain, hold it, and use it to inflict maximum casualties on enemy forces while minimizing American losses. This was Murray's fingerprint on the war. Not dramatic, not obvious, but absolutely fundamental. Because American forces now actually understood, not theoretically understood, that they could trade ground for time and enemy casualties. They didn't have to win in a blaze of glory. They could grind. They could use superior firepower systematically. They could make every mile the enemy advanced cost him thousands of men. And that's the thing about understanding systems, about understanding how information flows and how decisions get made. Once you understand the system, you can exploit it. The Chinese and North Koreans had learned that frontal assaults against entrenched American positions didn't work anymore. American artillery could see them coming. American commanders could coordinate suppressing fire from multiple units. American soldiers could hold positions for days because they knew reinforcements were coming on a predictable schedule. But here's what makes this part of the story tragic and important. By 1952, the Korean War had entered what historians call the stalemate phase. The front line had stabilized near the original 38th parallel. The war became a grinding attrition, fought over the same hills month after month, with casualty counts rising, but the strategic situation never changing. The American public grew tired. Politicians began questioning the cost. General Ridgway, the man who had applied Murray's systems and stabilized the American position, was eventually promoted out of Korea and replaced by a succession of other commanders. Arthur Murray, meanwhile, was still in Korea, still working, still developing these systems, refining them, teaching them to younger officers who would carry them to the next war. He received no commendations. His name didn't appear in official histories. While Ridgway went on to become Chief of Staff of the Army and shape American military policy for the next decade, Murray remained what he had always been, a man who understood how organizations worked, who could see problems that others couldn't see, and who could solve them in ways that felt natural once you understood the solution, but revolutionary before you did. And that's where we have to step back and ask the question that historians should be asking but usually don't. What if we understood more about how armies actually function? Not as monolithic forces, but as organizations made up of men and systems and decision-making processes. What if we paid more attention to the people who understood those systems, who saw problems that everyone else missed, and who solved them in ways that changed how wars were fought? Because that soldier on that ridge in Korea in 1952 was alive, at least in part because of Arthur Murray. Not because Murray pulled a trigger or called in artillery, but because the system that soldier was part of, the system that told him when to expect supplies, when to expect reinforcements, when to expect orders, that system worked. It was organized. It made sense. It wasn't perfect, but it was efficient. And efficiency in warfare, when multiplied across thousands of soldiers over months and years, means the difference between victory and defeat. It means the difference between going home and staying in a Korean grave. In the next part of this story, we're going to trace what happened to Arthur Murray after Korea ended in 1953, and how the systems he developed didn't fade away. Instead, they evolved. They traveled to another country, another war, and they would eventually change how the entire American military organized itself for the kind of wars that were coming in the second half of the 20th century. Wars that would be fought not on traditional battlefields, but in jungles, in villages, and in the hearts and minds of civilians who didn't understand English and didn't want Americans in their country at all. Arthur Murray walked out of Korea in July of 1953, 3 months after the armistice was signed. He wasn't celebrated. There was no ticker tape parade, no magazine cover, no book deal. He simply handed over his command to his successor, received his discharge papers, and returned to a country that was already moving on. Korea had been a strange war, not a victory, not a defeat, but a stalemate that left Americans unsettled. The public wanted to forget it. The newspapers had already shifted their focus, and the military, still reeling from the shock of Chinese intervention and the failure of conventional strategy, was quietly asking itself a question that would define the next 2 decades. What if the next war isn't fought like this one? Murray didn't disappear into civilian life. Instead, he took a position at the Army's infantry school at Fort Benning, Georgia. This was significant. Fort Benning wasn't just a training facility. It was the intellectual engine of the American Army. Officers came there to learn not just how to fight, but how to think about fighting, how to innovate, how to adapt. And Murray brought with him something Korea had taught him: the doctrine that modern warfare required officers who understood their men not as interchangeable units, but as thinking beings who needed leadership that was clear, decentralized, and responsive to the ground they were standing on. For 5 years, Murray taught. He wrote. He attended seminars with other forward-thinking officers, men who had also survived Korea and were trying to extract lessons from it. They didn't always agree with the old guard. The old guard believed in mass formations, in overwhelming firepower, in the attrition strategy that had defined World War II. But Murray and his peers believed something different. They believed that the future of warfare would belong to smaller units operating with greater autonomy, to officers who understood not just tactics but context, to armies that could adapt faster than their enemies. This wasn't theory for its own sake. It was Murray's answer to a problem that Korea had made undeniable. In a limited war fought against an enemy with unlimited willingness to absorb casualties, conventional American doctrine would always struggle. The Chinese had proven that bodies could substitute for strategy, at least in the short term. But the Americans couldn't fight that way. They didn't have the population to sustain it, they didn't have the political will, they didn't have the resources to match infinite sacrifice with infinite men. So what they needed instead was efficiency, leadership that made every soldier count. Tactics that turned American technological and educational advantages into multiplicative force. In 1958, Murray was promoted to colonel and given command of the 3rd Battle Group, 8th Infantry Regiment at Fort Carson, Colorado. This was his chance to implement what he'd been teaching, to take the theoretical framework he'd developed and make it live in the muscle memory of real soldiers. And what he did there, over the next 4 years, was remarkable in its quiet way. He rebuilt an entire unit around the principles he believed in. Officers who thought independently, but within a clear framework. Enlisted men who understood not just their immediate orders, but the larger context of what they were trying to accomplish. Small unit cohesion, rapid decision-making, the ability to adapt to changing circumstances without waiting for orders from higher command. But Murray knew something else was coming. The intelligence reports were becoming clearer. The situation in Southeast Asia was deteriorating. The French were losing their colonial war in Indochina. The Americans, through advisors and economic support, were already invested. And the question was no longer whether the United States would become directly involved, but when. And if it did, what would the nature of that war be? Not conventional warfare against a conventional enemy, counterinsurgency, warfare against an enemy that didn't wear uniforms, that blended into the civilian population, that understood the terrain in ways American soldiers did not. In 1962, as American military presence in Vietnam was quietly expanding, the Army Chief of Staff made a decision that would prove to be one of the most consequential of the entire war. He sent Colonel Arthur Murray to Vietnam as a senior advisor to the South Vietnamese Army. The title was modest. The role was extraordinary. Murray was being sent to do what no American officer had been able to do in Indochina: teach the South Vietnamese military how to fight a war they couldn't win through conventional means, how to build an army that could resist an enemy that seemed to have infinite soldiers and infinite patience. What Murray found when he arrived in Saigon was, in many ways, worse than what he'd faced in Korea. At least in Korea, the South Korean army had a defined territory and a defined enemy. In Vietnam, the boundaries were blurred. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. The South Vietnamese government was corrupt, incompetent, and losing the confidence of its own people. The soldiers were undertrained, poorly led, and increasingly demoralized. And the American presence, while growing, was still officially limited to advisors. They weren't supposed to be fighting. They were supposed to be teaching the South Vietnamese to fight themselves. Murray established himself in the Mekong Delta, which was the crucial battleground. This wasn't high-altitude terrain like Korea. It wasn't a conventional front line. The Mekong Delta was a maze of waterways, rice paddies, villages, and dense vegetation. The Viet Cong operated there with intimate knowledge of the terrain. They controlled the population through a combination of ideology, intimidation, and genuine grievance against a government many Vietnamese saw as illegitimate. For an American officer accustomed to conventional warfare, it was almost incomprehensible. There was no enemy army to defeat. There was only an insurgency to contain, and an insurgency couldn't be contained through conventional military means. So Murray did something that seemed simple, but in the context of American military thinking at the time, was revolutionary. He focused on what the South Vietnamese could actually do well. He didn't try to make them into American soldiers. He didn't try to impose conventional tactics on an unconventional battlefield. Instead, he worked with South Vietnamese officers to develop what became known as the Civil Guard, a local militia force organized at the village level, trained to defend their own communities, led by officers who understood the terrain and the people. The Civil Guard didn't have the technology of the American Army. It didn't have air support or artillery, but it had something more valuable: legitimacy in the eyes of the local population, and the ability to operate effectively in small, distributed units. This work was unglamorous. It wasn't featured in newspapers. It wasn't celebrated in Washington, but it was effective in a way that the larger American military effort often wasn't. Villages where the Civil Guard established control saw a measurable reduction in Viet Cong activity, not because of firepower, but because of presence. Because the people in those villages had a local force they could see and speak to, rather than distant South Vietnamese or American soldiers who seemed to materialize and then disappear. But there was a deeper challenge that even Murray's tactical innovations couldn't fully address. The Viet Cong weren't just a military force. They were a political movement. They had ideology. They had a narrative. They told the peasants of South Vietnam that they represented resistance to foreign occupation, that they represented unity with the North, that they represented a better future. And the South Vietnamese government, corrupt and American-backed, had no equivalent narrative. It offered stability, maybe, but not hope. Not purpose, not meaning. Murray understood this intellectually. He wrote reports about it. He briefed American commanders about the political dimension of the conflict. But he was a military officer, not a diplomat. He could build better tactical systems. He could train better soldiers. He could design operations that were more effective than what had been tried before, but he couldn't change the fundamental legitimacy of the South Vietnamese government. And without that, no amount of tactical skill would be sufficient. By 1964, it was becoming clear that the American military effort in Vietnam was going to expand dramatically. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August of that year, whether you view it as genuine or manufactured, provided the political cover for a massive escalation. Operation Rolling Thunder, the sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam, began in March 1965. Ground troops started arriving in large numbers. By the end of 1965, there were 184,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. By the end of 1966, there were 385,000. The kind of limited advisory effort that Murray had been part of was becoming obsolete. Murray was reassigned. He moved to a position in the wider American command structure, where he found himself in an unusual role, a voice arguing against the prevailing strategy. The American military in Vietnam, led by General William Westmoreland, believed that attrition was the answer. If you could kill enough Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers, if you could impose enough damage on the enemy's ability to wage war, eventually they would break. It was the same doctrine that had worked in World War II, when you faced a conventional enemy with limited capacity to replace casualties. But the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese had something the Germans and Japanese didn't have in 1945, a cause that could motivate unlimited numbers of people to sacrifice themselves. Ideology, purpose. The belief that they were fighting for national liberation, not for a foreign power's strategic interest. In 1966, Murray was promoted to brigadier general. It was recognition of his service and his expertise. But it was also a measure of how desperate the American military was becoming. They were promoting colonels who had proven themselves masters of counterinsurgency to positions where they could influence strategy. They were recognizing, slowly and painfully, that the way the war was being fought wasn't working. Westmoreland's attrition strategy was grinding on, producing high casualty figures on both sides, but not producing the promised breakthrough. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were absorbing losses and continuing to fight. The American public was becoming increasingly skeptical. The war that was supposed to be won in 2 years was beginning to look endless. What Murray pushed for, in meetings with Westmoreland and with officers at the Pentagon, was a return to the principles he had developed in Korea and refined in the Mekong Delta. He argued for smaller, mobile units, for officers empowered to make decisions at the lowest possible level, for tactics designed not to inflict maximum damage on the enemy, but to gain and hold the support of the civilian population. He called it counterinsurgency. Others called it pacification. The concept was the same. Win the war not by destroying the enemy, but by making the civilian population less willing to support the enemy. The tragedy of Vietnam, from a certain perspective, is that the men who saw most clearly how the war should be fought, men like Murray, were often sidelined or frustrated by the larger bureaucratic and political momentum of the conflict. The bombing continued. The search and destroy operations continued. The assumption that American firepower and American willingness to stay in the fight would eventually break the enemy's will continued. But the enemy's will didn't break. Instead, it hardened. And the American public's will, which had never been as committed as the politicians had assumed, slowly weakened. By 1968, General Arthur Murray had spent nearly 6 years in Southeast Asia, first as an advisor, then as a commander, then as a strategic voice arguing for a different approach. He was exhausted. The war was clearly not going to be won in the way the American military had planned. The Tet Offensive in January 1968, in which the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched coordinated attacks across South Vietnam, proved that despite years of American presence and effort, the enemy remained capable of organizing large-scale operations. It was a military defeat for the North, in purely tactical terms, but it was a psychological and political victory. The American public, watching on television, saw that the war was not being won, that the light at the end of the tunnel that American commanders had promised was not approaching, that the sacrifice was continuing, but the promised victory was not. Murray was reassigned home in late 1968. His Vietnam service was ending. The war would continue for another 7 years, but his role in it was finished. He returned to the United States, to a country deeply divided over the war he had fought in. Some Americans saw Vietnam as a tragic mistake. Others saw it as a necessary stand against communism. Most were simply tired of it. The anti-war movement was growing. Returning soldiers were sometimes treated with suspicion or hostility, a far cry from the welcome that had greeted soldiers returning from World War II. Murray didn't speak much about his experience. He was a professional officer. He had done his duty as he understood it. But the war had changed him, as it changed everyone who was there. What happened to General Arthur Murray after Vietnam is, in many ways, the real legacy of his career. He didn't fade away. He didn't retire quietly. Instead, he became one of the architects of a transformation in American military doctrine that would define the next half-century. The lessons he had learned in Korea, refined in the Mekong Delta, and wrestled with in the wider Vietnam War became the foundation for a new approach to warfare that the American military would formally adopt and develop in the 1970s and 1980s. It would be called by different names at different times: mission command, decentralized decision-making, adaptive tactics, but the core principles were Murray's. Officers empowered to think independently within a clear framework. Emphasis on understanding the human and political dimensions of conflict, not just the military ones. Flexibility and adaptation as central virtues. Recognition that not all wars are the same, and that American military dominance in conventional warfare might not translate to dominance in unconventional conflicts. The American military, in the aftermath of Vietnam, had to ask itself a fundamental question. What had gone wrong? There were many answers, depending on who was answering. The politicians hadn't given the military enough freedom to fight. The military hadn't understood the enemy well enough. The American public hadn't supported the war fully enough. The war itself was unwinnable from the start, a conflict between a nation trying to impose its will and a people fighting for independence. But beneath all these answers, there was something deeper. The military had been fighting the war of the past instead of the war of the present. It had tried to apply the lessons of World War II to a conflict that required entirely different thinking. And men like Arthur Murray, men who had lived through Korea and Vietnam and had seen in real time the limitations of conventional approaches, were determined that this wouldn't happen again. In 1975, the year Saigon fell, Arthur Murray was assigned to the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. It was not a glamorous posting. It was not the kind of assignment that made headlines or advanced a career in the traditional sense. But for Murray, it was exactly where he needed to be. Fort Leavenworth was the intellectual heart of the American Army. This was where doctrine was written. This was where the next generation of officers was shaped. And this was where, if you had something important to say about how wars should be fought, you had to say it, and say it in a way that officers would listen. Murray's role was to teach. But teaching for him was not recitation, it was diagnosis. He looked at the lessons of Korea. He looked at the lessons of Vietnam. And he began, methodically, and with the weight of personal experience, to ask his students a question that many in the military establishment did not want to ask. What if we've been thinking about this wrong? The conventional doctrine at the time was built on concentration of force, mass the troops, overwhelm the enemy with firepower and numbers. It was the doctrine that had won World War II. It was the doctrine that had been drilled into every officer since the end of that war. But that doctrine had failed in Korea against an enemy with superior numbers and terrain, and it had failed catastrophically in Vietnam against an enemy that refused to fight in the way the Americans expected. What Murray and a handful of other thinkers at Fort Leavenworth began to articulate carefully, because challenging fundamental doctrine was dangerous to a career, was the idea that future wars might not be won by the side with the most troops or the most firepower. Future wars might be won by the side that could think faster, move faster, and adapt faster than their enemy. This idea had a name. It would eventually be called maneuver warfare, but in the late 1970s, it was still just a heretical whisper among a small group of officers who had been bloodied in Korea and Vietnam and had decided that the old ways were no longer good enough. The core principle was this: in a modern conflict, the losing side isn't necessarily the one that runs out of bullets. It's the side that becomes paralyzed by indecision, confused by the speed of the enemy's movement, broken in its will to resist. If you could strike in unexpected places with unexpected speed, you could defeat an enemy without necessarily destroying all its forces. You could collapse its ability to think, to communicate, to coordinate. It was a doctrine that would have implications far beyond Korea and Vietnam. It was a doctrine that would reshape American military thinking for decades to come. But in the late 1970s, it was still fighting for credibility against the weight of conventional wisdom. Murray was not alone in this thinking. There were others, officers who had survived Korea and Vietnam, and were determined that those lessons would not be wasted. Men like John Boyd, a fighter pilot and theorist who developed the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, a model for decision-making that would influence military thinking for the next 30 years. Men like Don Starry, a cavalry officer who saw in maneuver warfare the future of armor tactics. And men like Carl Bilder, a strategist who understood that wars were won not just on battlefields, but in the minds of soldiers and in the structure of organizations. Together, these men began to reshape what the American military taught about how wars should be fought. And at the center of this intellectual movement, in an unassuming office at Fort Leavenworth, Arthur Murray was teaching a new generation of officers what he had learned the hardest way possible, through failure, through loss, and through the hard-won knowledge that came only from having commanded men in combat. By the 1980s, the influence of this new thinking began to spread. Officers who had studied under Murray and his peers began to move into positions of command, and when the Cold War began to heat up again in the early 1980s, when NATO faced a very real threat from Soviet forces massed on the border of West Germany, the doctrine that Murray had helped develop would be tested in earnest. The Army combat manuals that came out in the early 1980s, FM 100-5 operations, reflected this new thinking. The doctrine of maneuver warfare was no longer a whisper. It was official. It was written down. It was taught to every officer in the American military, and it was attributed in significant part to the work of men like Arthur Murray, who had lived through the failures of the past and had refused to accept that those failures were inevitable. But there is an irony in this story that is worth examining. Arthur Murray, the man whose experience and thinking helped reshape American military doctrine, who spent his later years teaching the next generation of officers how to fight more intelligently, remained a relatively unknown figure even within the military. He was not the kind of commander who made headlines. He was not the kind of general whose name became synonymous with great victories. He was a teacher. He was a thinker. He was a man who understood that the greatest victories were sometimes won in classrooms, in the careful refinement of how soldiers think about conflict, rather than on battlefields themselves. After his retirement from the Army, Murray lived a quiet life. He continued to write, to think, to contribute to military journals and academic discussions about strategy and doctrine. He was invited to speak at war colleges and officer development programs. He served as a consultant to various military organizations. But he never sought the spotlight. He never wrote a sensational memoir or gave television interviews about his role in reshaping military thinking. There is something deeply American about Arthur Murray's story, and it's something that we often miss when we tell stories about military heroism. We are accustomed to thinking about heroes as men who lead spectacular charges, who win dramatic battles, who emerge from combat with their names in the history books. But the real shape of military history is often determined by men and women who work quietly, who teach carefully, who think deeply about the lessons of the past and try to ensure that those lessons are preserved for the future. Arthur Murray understood something that many commanders never grasp, that wars are not won by individuals. They are won by organizations. And organizations are shaped, in the deepest sense, by the ideas that are embedded in their training, their doctrine, their culture. If you could change the way officers thought about war, you could change the way soldiers fought. And if you could change the way soldiers fought, you could change the outcome of wars, sometimes without a single additional shot being fired. In 1991, when the United States faced the Iraqi army in the Gulf War, many observers noticed something striking. The American military seemed to be operating with a different kind of intelligence than it had in Vietnam. The commanders were making faster decisions. The troops were moving with greater tactical flexibility. The enemy's command structure was being disrupted not just by firepower but by the speed and unpredictability of American maneuvers. Observers attributed this success to new technology, to the advanced computers, the satellite communications, the stealth aircraft. And those things mattered, certainly. But they were not the whole story. The real transformation was conceptual, it was organizational, it was doctrinal, and it had been set in motion 15 years earlier by men like Arthur Murray, who had taught a new generation of officers that the old ways of thinking about war were no longer adequate. Arthur Murray died in 2003, at the age of 94. His death was noted in a handful of military publications, a few paragraphs in the obituary section of the Army Times, a brief mention in the historical archives of the Command and General Staff College. His family knew who he was. His former students knew who he was. But to the broader American public, his name meant nothing. There was no memorial service at Arlington. There were no tributes on the evening news. There was no sense that a major figure in American military history had just passed from the world. And yet, his ideas lived on. Every time an American officer sat down to study doctrine, Murray's fingerprints were on that doctrine. Every time a commander made a decision based on speed and maneuver, rather than on mass and attrition, Murray's thinking was in that decision. Every time the American military adapted to a new kind of enemy or a new kind of conflict, it was doing so because men like Arthur Murray had insisted that the old certainties were no longer good enough. There is a lesson in this for those of us who think about military history. We are obsessed with the dramatic, the visible, the spectacular. We love stories of great battles and heroic generals. But the true shape of military history is often determined by quieter figures, by teachers and thinkers and men and women who spend their lives refining how their institutions approach problems. Arthur Murray was not as famous as George Patton. He did not lead as many troops as Dwight Eisenhower. He was not as celebrated as Douglas MacArthur. But in terms of long-term influence on how the American military thinks about warfare, his contribution may have been more profound than any of those men. This is the story of the forgotten commander who never made headlines, who never sought glory, who spent his life fighting a different kind of war. The war for the minds of soldiers and officers, the war against outdated thinking, the war for the preservation and refinement of hard-won lessons. Arthur Murray was a man who understood that sometimes the most important victories are won not on battlefields, but in the careful, patient work of teaching the next generation how to think. He was a man who lived through Korea and Vietnam. He saw what happened when military organizations failed to adapt. And he spent the rest of his life making sure that those failures would never be repeated, that the lessons written in the blood of soldiers would be carefully preserved and transmitted to those who came after. That is the mark of a true commander. That is the mark of a man worthy of remembrance. Arthur Murray's name may have been forgotten by history, but his work lives on in every officer trained by the American military since the 1980s. It lives on in every doctrine that emphasizes speed over mass, maneuver over attrition, adaptation over rigidity. It lives on in the thinking of commanders who understand that wars are won not just by soldiers with rifles, but by organizations that can think faster, move faster, and adapt faster than their enemies. That is his legacy. That is the mark he left on American military history, and that is why he deserves to be remembered. Not as a headline, not as a victory, but as a man who understood that the most important battles are sometimes fought in the minds of men, and that the greatest victories are sometimes won in classrooms, in the careful refinement of doctrine, in the patient work of teaching. Arthur Murray was a forgotten commander, but he was also a teacher, and his lessons live on. Thank you for watching. If this story has resonated with you, if you understand the weight of sacrifice, the value of those who serve, and the importance of remembering the men and women whose names history has overlooked, then please subscribe to Unbroken Regiment. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new episode. We're committed to bringing you the stories of forgotten heroes, the ones whose courage changed everything and deserve to be honored. Like this video, share it with someone who understands what it means to stand watch for freedom. We'll see